On this episode, American metaphysical religion. Most Americans assume the United States was founded by pious Christians. However, as my guest reveals in his new book, from the very beginning, America was a vibrant blend of beliefs from all four corners of the world. Again, the book is Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. There it is. And Ronnie Pontiac worked as Manly P. Hall's research assistant, screener, and designated substitute lecturer for 7 years. He's produced award-winning documentaries and has written for Invisible College Magazine, Newtopia, Metapsychosis, A Cult of Personality, and The Original Reality Sandwich. And he joins us from Los Angeles. Hey, Ronnie, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
My pleasure. Let's talk about a fellow Canadian, Manly P. Hall. For those not familiar, just tell us a little bit about this gentleman who founded the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles, where you worked.
He was most famous for a book that's come to be known as The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which was a compendium of obscure esoteric knowledge that he had acquired during trips to Europe after the Great War, when he was the Second Great War, the World War II, where he acquired rare manuscripts and books, and he found in them inspiring wisdom that he wanted to share. So he created this book when he was still a young man as an encyclopedia of Western esotericism. He gave lectures for decades at the Philosophical Research Society, thousands of them. You can hear him on YouTube, where he's a popular lecturer, even though he has not been with us for about 20, 30 years. And he, when I knew him, was in his 80s, and I found him to be one of the most decent and kind and honorable human beings that I've ever met.
And what did you do for him? What is a screener?
I was the one that would look at his letters, take his phone calls, and sometimes take meetings with people who wanted to meet with him, but who he or his secretary found to be possibly questionable or maybe even dangerous, or perhaps troubled in a way that he could not address. And so that was my job, was to only let the people through who they felt Manly Hall could help.
So my understanding is he kept a lot of his earlier, I guess, dabblings in the occult kind of under lock and key. He was very cautious about people sort of going down maybe a path that he went down. He was fearful that it could cause, psychological, maybe even some spiritual harm. Can you talk to me about that?
That is true. There was a cabinet in which not only were those lectures and writings under lock and key, but so were the works of Crowley. And I believe he had Eliphas Levi in there as well, although he would often write about him, somebody who's a really constant source of inspiration, a French Parisian ceremonial magician in a sense, but simply an esotericist who, like most of us, combined influences from all over the place into something that was what we would recognize today as American metaphysical religion, or at least that's what academia is calling this area of study.
And what particular? I mean, did he talk to you about this? Like, these were areas that I got into and stay away, or was there a warning, a caveat?
No, we never talked about that, but I can tell you a story about his wife Marie, who told us that when she met him, he lived in a dark house with blackout curtains and had what she described as a dwarf manservant. And she said that he would have these creepy parties, as she described it, with swamis and weird musicians and actresses and such. And she claimed, I'm sure she really did this, that as soon as she entered his life, it was an end to all that. And she opened up all the windows and made sure he ate a hearty breakfast.
What was what was I mean, was were there concerns he had with Aleister Crowley, or
Yes, I think that I mean, I certainly met, how do I put this? Amongst the people that I screened, I found that there were two sorts of spiritual practices that were most likely to cause serious problems. One was spiritualism, the mediumship, essentially, and the other was ceremonial magic, and particularly in the OTO kind of variety as it evolved in the 60s in America, sort of as a rebellious approach to the Hermetic tradition. And I'm not saying that the traditions themselves are in some way at fault. It's what happens when people who have personal issues that have not been addressed enter these paths, and then these problems can become amplified.
is that to suggest that these spiritualism or these traditions have a certain a power, or that they, I don't know, they bring discredit to I don't know, different types of esoteric sciences, let's say.
I think it's like everything else in life. I think that you find a whole bunch of people who don't know what they're doing but claim the title. And then you find a middle ground of people who know something about the subject and are competent. And then you find a few experts who are really brilliant at what they do, whether that's a sport or a doctor or a lawyer or a metaphysician or a spiritualist or a ceremonial magician. I think and there are people who approach those areas of life and they become disasters for them. So people who want to be sports heroes, but being an athlete turns out to be a disastrous choice, to me is comparable to a ceremonial magician. Somebody wants to do this, but because of perhaps some kind of psychological damage, it turns out to be a dangerous path for them.
Did Manly P. Hall believe that's what happened to Aleister Crowley?
I'm not sure. The only thing that he ever said to me about Aleister Crowley, he certainly appreciated him on a level. I think that he felt that Crowley was a bad influence, perhaps, from his observation. And I think that what he said to me was that he thought that Aleister Crowley would have been the poet laureate of England had he not been mad as a hatter.
Interesting, interesting. So, the Hermeticism. I mean, I'm not asking for it would take too long to give us even a crash course in Hermeticism. But you can maybe highlight some of the major tenets of Hermeticism. This, I guess, blending of a Greek and Egyptian spirituality.
That was nicely said. Well, it's a very rich tradition and very interesting one because originally it was thought that the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, this Egyptian god and master teacher, were from ancient Egypt, and so they predated the Gospels and even the Hebrew Bible. And in the fading pagan world, and also among esotericists, this was a very popular scripture to appeal to, for saying that not only is our tradition just as old and older than yours, but also it has this great depth of wisdom. And it turned out later that very likely the works had been created in around 400, I would say, maybe 300, and that it was created by Neoplatonists most likely. And for generations, scholars thought, well, that must be the case then, that these were just forgeries. But now scholars are arguing that although they were probably put together then by the Neoplatonists, that much of the matter in them does agree with ancient Egyptian theology, and that perhaps they were trying to lay down in writing what had been an oral tradition that really did originate in Egypt. And so these teachings, which are in the form of the master talking to a student, and which are very much in agreement with many Neoplatonic observations about life, seem to typify what became the Western esoteric tradition. And we see the influence in America in the late 1880s or so with the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which is literally teaching their version of Hermetica. As far as the teaching itself, I just hate to even. I want to recommend to everyone that they read about it themselves, because it's an adventure, and you do it an injustice by trying to explain it in a few moments.
Understood. Understood. But this early influence of Hermeticism and even the occult in early America. You talked about the 1800s, like during the Wild West. The OK Corral. You had. Was it Alexander Wilder, this American physician, who's a Neoplatonist, a scholar, early member of the Theosophical Society, who was, I guess, kind of the father of holistic medicine in America? Is that fair to say? Or early?
He was a huge influence. Yeah, it was called eclectic medicine in those days, and he wrote the great encyclopedia instruction book for eclectic doctors.
So. Well, tell me more about Alexander Wilder.
Sure. Actually, the reason that the book exists, my book exists, is because when I was working with Manly Hall in his vault of rare books, I found this huge tome, a leather-bound tome, and when I opened it, it was a newspaper, bound issues of newspapers, and this newspaper was called The Platonist. And it dated from the time of the OK Corral from St. Louis, Missouri. I could not imagine what this thing was. It went against everything I knew about that time and place. And it turned out that the publisher, Thomas Johnson, was I don't know why or how he did it, but he created this thing that existed for a couple of years and provided translations of Proclus and Plotinus and Plato, and also esoteric translations. Abner Doubleday, who was once thought to have invented baseball and was a Civil War general, he had translated the works of Eliphas Levi, who we had mentioned earlier, the Parisian Magus. And so this esoteric newspaper in the middle of the Old West set me off on this 40-year search for information about who these people were that were behind it, because even Manly Hall had very little knowledge of who they were. One of them was Alexander Wilder. We had a few of his books in the PRS library, but we still didn't know a great deal about him, and even Mr. Hall didn't know much about him. So I went off looking for information. I couldn't find any for a long time, but during this time, academia has experienced a revolution, and the approach toward esoteric studies has completely changed. And the amount of work that has happened now, I would say in the last 20 years, more has happened in terms of researching this subject in an academic setting than has ever happened in history, all put together. And go ahead.
Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they're publishing a newspaper and Abner Doubleday is publishing a translation of Eliphas Levi, obviously they have an audience in America, which is, when you think about it, it's not just, these are not just isolated. There has to be a business argument to be publishing this stuff.
Yeah, it was very
critical.
Yes, it's actually fascinating. It was very popular. And there were Plato clubs all through the Midwest, which then was the Far West. And often they were teachers from the local schools and the wives of well-to-do men, what few intellectuals there might be in the town. And they would celebrate Plato's birthday. They would have reading assignments and guest speakers, including Alexander Wilder, who would come around and talk to them about Platonic concepts. And it was really quite the rage. In fact, newspapers and magazines carried stories about Plato. It was big news when Yale University announced a new translation. There were big articles in magazines talking about the Platonic tradition and the Neoplatonists. it was fascinating to me how neglected this was. There's only one book written about it called Platonism in the Midwest. I think it was 1962 or 63. And the funny thing was that a few years later, when I was a musician touring, I was back home though, and I was at a store across from the Whiskey A Go-Go that had been there since the days of Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix, called the Hippocampus. And when I walked in there, they had a few leather-bound books on a table. It was a store of all kinds of curios. And I picked it up, and it was The Platonist bound in leather. And I was stunned to see it in the store on Sunset Boulevard. I went to the proprietor and asked if we could buy it, thinking there's no way I can afford this thing. It was probably worth, and these days probably not much because you can get it online, but back then it was worth a lot of money. And he went and called the owner of the store, who was this woman who had retired, and she told him, asked him to ask me, is this just for decor or are you reading it? I said, oh, definitely to read. And she sold it to me for $100, along with a couple of very old Thomas Taylor translations of Plato and the Neoplatonists. So when I had this book back in my life, it really started me back on the trail of what became this book that we're talking about.
Ronnie, we'll take a quick time out, come back, and continue to discuss American metaphysical religion. Back with more in a moment. Every new season, we find a reason to improve our lives and our health. And C60 Evo organic edible oils deliver noticeable benefits quickly. A spoonful in the morning delivers energy and endurance all day long, and I sleep deeper and wake up feeling refreshed because C60 ESS60 works. Carbon 60 received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1996 when it was used for industrial applications. C60 Evo's ESS60 is a breakthrough technology, upgrading C60 to be safe for human and pet consumption. ESS60 has been called a miracle molecule because of the physical and mental benefits people are enjoying. Their lab has a proven track record of 31 years and thousands of happy customers across the world, just like me. So treat yourself, your friends, and your family to C60 Evo and use my link, EVRS, to get 10% off your first order. Again, my link, EVRS, to get 10% off your first order. Ronnie Pontiac is with us, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric, and Mystical Traditions of the New World. So this was a surprise to you. This was a surprise to Manly P. Hall. Was this information just forgotten, or was there an active suppression of this? You know, the deep roots that this has in the West.
I think it's a little bit of both. First, in academia, in religious studies, the only worthy subjects for many generations of scholars were the established historical institutions, the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church. Even studying Pentecostals was considered somewhat radical. Everything else was considered superstitious fringe and dismissed. Even the Neoplatonists were dismissed as being simply an attempt to compete with Christianity. So there was a kind of suppression in that scholars were raised to view their subject this way. The revolution that occurred happened when several important writers applied in religious studies something that was being applied elsewhere, which was the idea that we should examine these subjects without critiquing or judging them. We want to know what happened. We want to preserve what happened. And later, perhaps we can theorize about that. But until we've captured what's out there, we shouldn't be making opinions about what's important and what isn't. Now, we've seen it, for one example is the study of the Rosicrucians, which was very influenced by a British scholar named Francis Yates, who had a romanticized view of the story, but nevertheless very inspiring to many people, including myself. And this year, Nadine Ackerman, who has spent 20 years studying Princess Elizabeth Stuart, who was the Winter Queen of Bohemia, who was at the center of a lot of the original Rosicrucian fervor, published a book that absolutely changes the picture of the whole environment that Rosicrucianism happened in. Because for the first time, a scholar examined her letters, her ciphers, or the papers that had survived, things that for hundreds of years people had thought were unworthy of study because they were simply a woman's leftovers. Now we see that, in fact, she was a very important part of what was going on in those times, and what we learned from those letters changes everything in that area of study. And that's happening all over the place.
You'll have to
So,
explain, excuse me, Ronnie, what
mhm.
you call the Rosicrucian fervor. You'll have to
Okay.
say the background on that.
This was around in the very early 1600s. These manifestos were released. It's a fascinating story. No one's sure who did it. They were anonymous, and they said that they were representing a school called the Rosicrucians, and that they were bringing a revolution to the world. It would be the end of the power of the Pope. There would be a new world ruled by science, and there would be freedom, and there would be an understanding of what nature can bring to us instead of a fear of it or a domination of it. Although this was taken very seriously, and part of it was, they said, we're a secret society, and we can be invisible, and we can be in several places at once. And if you are interested, you need only mention it out loud, and if you are worthy, then we will contact you. They caused this panic. People thought they were called the Devil's Jesuits, and they thought there were these occultists had been let loose on the world. And now in recent scholarship, we're seeing that it's very likely that the people behind these manifestos were students, university students, who metaphorically may have had more in common with the beats than being some sort of metaphysical masters who had had this idea that would revolutionize everyone. They created this fervor where hundreds of books and pamphlets were written saying that they were a fraud, that they were right, that the author should be a member and should be allowed to join. And all kinds of people were discredited as Rosicrucians. Descartes was accused of being a Rosicrucian, and it was a very serious accusation. But the school became influential. They call it this Rosicrucian school over time. Whatever its beginning, it was an ideal that was imitated by generation after generation. There were organizations that were created that purported to be the Rosicrucian Society or to have charters from it. And they continue to this day. And whether they have anything to do with actual Rosicrucian origins or not is something that's still argued about in academia. But the rich cultural history of Rosicrucianism actually comes into America very early in Pennsylvania with Ephrata and other communities who are applying these ideas that have come from German mystics like Jacob Boehme, Paracelsus, and also from these early individuals who we now call Rosicrucians. Most of the people that are thought of and written about as Rosicrucians today are people who denied that they were Rosicrucians. But of course, that's the conundrum, because a Rosicrucian would deny being a Rosicrucian.
So what is the heresy with the Rosicrucians? Is that what we're talking about, a heresy? That's why they denied? That's why you could discredit someone by referring to them as such?
Well, the form of insult changed over time. It began as a religious heresy because they actually talked about killing the Pope, that they wanted there to be no more popes. And they also had let's just say that they were very much on the Protestant side of things. They thought that the splendor of the Catholic Church and the ritual of it and all of the things that those were pagan and were things that had actually poisoned the religion. So in that sense, they were rather orthodox for their time. But over time, they became known. Rosicrucian meant that you were some kind of a fake, fraudulent hustler who was trying to put one over on people with your magical BS. But then even later, it became just a feckless dreamer who doesn't really know what's going on and has these crazy theories.
Early governors in the United States, the governor of, was it Connecticut?
Connecticut colony. Hmm.
Connecticut colony. This was the son of John Winthrop Sr., who was the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a Rosicrucian?
Well, that's a very interesting question because it depends on your definition of the term. He went to Europe seeking Rosicrucians as a young man. He said he didn't find any. He certainly never claimed to be a Rosicrucian. However, he did live his life inspired by the Rosicrucian ideals. He became someone who was very skilled at healing. He was known as Connecticut's doctor. He used Paracelsian medicine and his alchemical experimentation and practices to create medicines that were considered very effective at the time. And he had groups of nurses that he trained to dispense his medicines all over Connecticut to help people. He protected the innocent as the weak, as Rosicrucians were supposed to. He protected some of the tribes from the stronger tribes, for example, when they were being viciously attacked. And so in a sense, he lived as close as he could to the Rosicrucian ideal. Manly Hall was of the opinion at the end of his life that in that sense, John Winthrop Jr. would be a Rosicrucian. He may never have been initiated by some sort of a secret society of people, but the life of dedicated ideals, a life of dedication to ideals that he lived was a Rosicrucian life, which he exemplified. And therefore, in a sense, he is a Rosicrucian.
First presidents of Yale and Harvard were alchemists. True?
True. That is true. And many presidents of both, actually.
Tell me more. I mean, when we're talking about someone being an alchemist, what do we mean?
Well, there was a time there when alchemy was really the exciting hobby. But it was more than that, because for the greedy, for people who had only the lowest motivations, it was a way to daydream of tinkering lead into gold and suddenly being wealthy. For people who had the highest aspirations, they believed that you had to live the purest life in order to achieve transmutation and the philosopher's stone. And so therefore it was a spiritual path. And for most people, it was the beginnings of chemistry, really. It was experimentation with how in a laboratory setting you could change one matter to another. Now, they believed that everything had a soul. Even metal had a soul. So within lead, there was a soul that you could say longed to evolve to be gold. And a pure alchemist could find the right wisdom to help that lead evolve itself into gold. And so people were fascinated with it as what wasn't even known as science yet, but it was the beginning of science. They were fascinated with it as a way of potentially becoming wealthy or discovering a great medicine. And even couples would be involved sometimes, sisters and brothers, or wives and husbands often would work together in the laboratory on these projects, trying to replicate results from books that described how to do these things, or from teachers that had taught them. And so at Yale and Harvard, their laboratories were put into place for the students to work in, and alchemical experimentation was encouraged.
If alchemists were running Harvard and Yale, how did alchemy filter down into medical schools? Well, let's just start with that. Medical schools, for example.
Well, yes, certainly, because it was so deeply bound with medicine. Many alchemists were working. The thing about the Philosopher's Stone was that not only did it represent enlightenment, but it also represented health. It represented total healing. So the desire to create medicines was certainly part of alchemy, and Paracelsian medicine and the influence of Paracelsus on alchemy were at the center. Part of the reason why so much of this experimentation was happening originally in Germany. And so this was taken as science. It was a great improvement over what had been used. They were taking frogs and cutting them in half and tying them on the soles of the feet of Prince Henry in England when he was dying of a fever. because they thought that was going to cure him, or the weapons salve, where you would put this goop on a weapon that had wounded somebody, and their wound would heal 100 miles away, or maybe it was 4 miles away. And so medicine was extremely primitive. Now, at least with Paracelsian medicine, you were getting people who were working with herbs, who were finding out what indigenous and local cures were. Paracelsus famously walked his way across Europe, talking to every witch and doctor and just anyone he could find who was working with these natural substances, believing that nature had the cure for everything.
So the role of, I guess, this friction, let's say, between materialists and Rosicrucians or the hermeticists, how did that end up advancing science?
That's very interesting. There's a moment where let's take the example of Robert Flood, who was somebody who's often thought of as a Rosicrucian, and who was this polymath who wrote books in which he tried to explain everything, how everything worked. It was almost an Aristotelian endeavor. And then let's take an example like Mermer, who wrote the book Harmonie Universelle, who was a Jesuit. And Mermer wrote that book, Harmonie Universelle, was a wonderful compendium of everything about music. But one of the chapters in it was about the science, what would become the science of acoustics. He was like the father of acoustics, because he was the first person to come along and say, sound has nothing to do with planetary Pythagorean ratios or any other kind of magic. Sound is what happens when a vibration reaches the nerves in your ear. And this was really the beginning of materialism in a sense, even though he was a Jesuit. And what he was fighting was Flood's magical ideas. So these two going at each other in pamphlet wars were opening the doors to something that would make their belief systems obsolete. They didn't know it, and they were inviting science in this fascinating way. So the church itself went from science is just bad, and we're going to kill Bruno, and we're going to threaten Galileo, and then you wind up with a Jesuit who is the hub of the development of science in Europe at that time. So it was happening on both sides, in a sense, among the esotericists who were fanciers of the Rosicrucians, who saw science as liberation from superstition and the domination of the confessional. And then on the other side, you've got a Jesuit who's fighting the esotericists by saying, no, your magic is false. That's just science. And doesn't realize what that's going to turn into.
Another timeout awaits, and then back with more of my conversation with Ronnie Pontiac. Stay with us. November reminds us to be thankful and focused on boosting our radiant health before winter. And I use a potent remedy that's improved the quality of my life and deepened my sleep as well. I take C60 Evo olive oil every morning, and I have a lot more energy and mental focus all day long. My workouts are easier, and I have a lot more endurance. If you're into competitive sports, this is a game changer. Health is our greatest wealth, and Pura C60 ESS60 really works. ESS60 is a breakthrough technology delivering the carbon-60 miracle molecule for humans and pets. Check out the C60 Evo holiday gift collections for everyone on your list. They make amazing skin, lip, and hair repair serum that deliver noticeable results quickly. C60 Evo's lab has an impressive track record of 31 years and, of course, my personal recommendation. You deserve the best remedies on earth, and so do those you love. Buy direct from the lab and upgrade your life today. Use my code EVRS to save 10% off your first order. Again, my code EVRS and save 10% off your first order. Ronnie Pontiac, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. How did Hermeticism, Rosicrucianism, the Esoteric, how did it impact Christianity in the New World?
That's a fascinating area of study. I have what might be an extreme point of view about this, which is that I feel that it's possible that American Christianity resembles American metaphysical religion more than it does Christianity. And here's why I say that in a simple, quick form. In Europe, traditionally, whether we were dealing with Calvinists or even earlier in the medieval period, Christianity meant that this world was a place of suffering. You accepted your poverty. You perhaps even expected damnation because it was pride to think that you were good enough to not be damned. You were to help each other. You were to turn the other cheek. You were not to be rich because being rich was a detriment to getting to heaven. Now, in America, Christianity has fairly rapidly began changing into what became known as the prosperity gospel, where, and of course this existed in Europe as well, although not as overtly. There is the idea that if I'm in harmony with the divine, then I'm going to have a life that is utopian. I'm going to have wealth, I'm going to be happy, and nothing bad will happen to me because I will be protected. And certainly this has been a core belief in every religion since the beginning of time. But in America, Christianity took on this idea with a vengeance and pretty much left behind the idea of this world as a place of suffering, pretty much left behind the idea. So many great Christian saints and also Protestant writers were people who embraced suffering, who embraced poverty, who felt that they could find God more easily that way. And today we find churches telling people that they should give more to the church because that way they'll get more from God and everybody can prosper and have a great time. And that if you're unhappy or if you're suffering bad luck or bad health, just get right with God. Now, this is really at the essence of American metaphysical religion, the idea that my soul is what organizes my body. And if I get my soul right, then my body will be right, and then my life will be right. And this idea that I deserve this prosperity because I have made certain adjustments to my life it's not that far off from some form of ceremonial magic or something where we're trying to use our will to achieve our ends. So it's a different approach to Christianity. And I think that there's a new book out by Catherine Albanese just this month that talks about how in America, nature and the pursuit of happiness kind of redefined Christianity and redefined perhaps even religiosity, because if you think of how Buddhism is looking at a world that is a place of suffering and Christianity is, and Islam, the world is a snare. And here is America saying, no, the pursuit of happiness is religious. If I can find my happiness, that means I am right with God. That means that I am on the proper spiritual path. That's a very different concept of Christianity.
Do you have an opinion as to whether that's a positive development?
Not really, because I just enjoy seeing all the developments. I don't know. I know too much history to think that something that looks good might not turn out bad, and vice versa. So I don't really have a personal opinion about whether that's a good thing or not. I think it's fascinating to see a religion evolve and how different spiritual beliefs influence each other. And especially here in America, where there seems to be this readiness that used to cause a lot of anxiety among academics in the mid-century, in the 1900s. The idea that they called it Sheilaism, or they called it bricolage, that Americans were just taking what they wanted from everywhere and making these fake religions for themselves that were absolutely unique to the individual and therefore would destroy community. But what we're finding is that people are reinventing religions. They are finding new spiritual paths. They are taking the entirety of our heritage of spirituality in the world and treating it as something that they can study and potentially benefit from, and responding to the things that they resonate to in a way that I don't know if it's happened before, that so many people have looked at religion as something where they can choose what path they want to take, rather than this is the only right path that I was born with and I cannot deviate from it.
What do you make of the explosion, really, in interest in the occult in the United States? For example, and this is not that new. I mean, it's probably been around for 40 or 50 years, this explosion in interest in things like divination, Ouija boards, tarot cards, astrology. What does that indicate to you?
It's happened repeatedly in the history of the United States. And I would say that this time around, it's not even as striking as, for instance, during the days of spiritualism at the end of the 1800s, where it was truly a mania. I mean, everybody had tables tapping, and everybody wanted to meet a medium, and everybody just thought it was fascinating. Like Platonism had been not that long before that. I think that people focus on reinterpreting the truth for their time. And that in America, somehow, we feel freer to do that than we do in most places.
Just on a side note, you mentioned spiritualism. Was that empowering to women in the, let's say, the late 19th century, because so many mediums were women?
I think so, in the sense that here you had a culture where a woman was probably not going to be allowed to say very much in the presence of men. And a good medium could command an auditorium full of men and tell them what they were doing wrong and suggest how they should live their lives and be listened to. So it was empowering. Now, ironically, most of these women were channeling male spirits. So they were disempowering themselves within this empowerment. But certainly it coexisted in many ways, in many places, happily with the whole suffragette movement. And there were famous suffragettes who practiced mediumship or experiments in that area. And there were mediums who became strong feminists. So, and the other interesting thing about that, by the way, is talking about indigenous Americans, that within this, the most popular form of spirit guide for women tended to be indigenous Americans. So in a weird way, women who were so terribly suppressed without even the vote at that point, and the natives who'd been decimated, the indigenous Americans were brought together in this, do we call it unconscious? Do we call it spiritual? I don't know. But this eruption suddenly of opinions coming from allegedly native and clearly female from the gender of the medium sources. That was a big revolution.
What's the number one message or takeaway you want people to have from American metaphysical religion?
I want them to know that their heritage as Americans is much wider than they know, and that there's so much to find out about our country that changes perhaps the way we may feel about it, because having only received one side of the story, suddenly discovering that there are all these characters, all these brave people who dared to find their own paths, who dared to combine religions that hadn't been combined before, or to pay attention to people that had been dismissed. All these people existed throughout our history as a country. And instead of feeling that we are so limited in our choices, and that in fact this was simply a Christian country and that's the only right way, we are now able to see, thanks to the work of all these academics, that this country is filled with examples of people who are quintessentially American and who embrace the esoteric from the start, from the very beginnings of colonization.
What would you like to think Manly P. Hall would think of this book?
Oh, I don't know. I did partially write it to continue his work, to be able to add all the new scholarship that he didn't have access to the dialogue.
How do we get a copy?
It's available from the publisher Inner Traditions. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other platforms. And I'm sure it'll be in some stores. If you want to order it, that's always wonderful from a store. Support local businesses if you can.
Like the Bodhi tree in LA?
Well, the Bodhi tree is no more, sadly. But places like that, absolutely.
Ronnie, great meeting you. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Nice to meet you also.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.